So we actually are just touching the top of the iceberg when we quote big figures of losses. We are not really touching the real underpinning of losses. Nor do we touch who pays. And I think that's going to be not only that losses are significant, that low-income countries, islands, depending on the nature of the economy, can suffer an annual loss to their GDP between 3 to 12%, 15%. Big countries absorb these losses easier, particularly if they are big and wealthy. But small countries have a constant erosion at the same time as they try to build the development gains. Now, the issue of who pays is very important because in most countries, how big of the portion of the national economy is actually public sector? You know that better than I do, but let's say 50%, 20%, 80% is private sector. So if there is a disaster and a country, which is very normal, absorbs the losses through disaster relief funds, through extra budget allocations to compensate people, that's a big amount of money. Let's say you are a normal, average, middle-income or low-income country, very, very minimal insurance penetration, so there is no risk transfer mechanism. So who actually pays? Well, people do. Private individuals pay. So this is the way we for generations have been able to absorb the shocks and cost of disasters. But it's also held back countries' aspirations. And this is where I think we are today. We talk a lot about the economics of disasters. We talk about it more and more, and it's really important to understand. But I think we now have to come closer to where we actually begin to look at what's the remedy. And the public sector, I think we now, governments have some very good instruments they put in place. Insurance industry is hesitating. There's a lot of talk about reinsurance innovation, but the reinsurance industry themselves say, we are not innovating right now. We know we have to do it, but there is no incentive because the risks are high for us. So we need public sector feeding some money into the innovation for insurance instruments. So I'm just to say that I do really think that this is the big issue for the next few years in terms of thinking development gains and safeguarding development gains. In the Global Assessment Report 2009 that ISDR issues, but it's really a big partnership effort, it says that almost 85% of mortality risk to earthquakes is concentrated in lower middle income countries. And which highlights that while wealthy countries appear to be less risk prone, until very recently I would say, than poorer countries, but most of the recent risks to earthquakes have accumulated in countries that are rapidly expanding their economies. And it means that disaster risk increases if the exposure of people and assets to natural hazards increases faster than the countries can strengthen their risk reduction capacity, and including the capacity of governance, quality of institutions, transparency, accountability. Just something like who's in charge of disaster risk reduction. And that's a very practical question. In most countries and organizations internationally, this responsibility is so diffused into so many institutions, so it's really hard to know who you expect to drive the system very firmly. And this is really something that I think holds back lots of the very good practical work that we have a readiness to do. Now this issue of how middle-income countries in particular are vulnerable, they are without any question the most vulnerable. Why? Because of the fast developing economy, because they have resources, lots of construction, but the institutional capacity to regulate and set standards does not keep up pace with the very rapid growth, particularly in private sector. And the innovation, creativeness, etc., everything that drives development is the strongest driving force. So the accumulation of risk is very significant, and therefore the costs are very significant when it does strike. This year, the global assessment report that will be launched in a very few weeks now, in early May, it takes a good look and a very, very interesting look on the macroeconomics of disaster risk, not losses. It looks at, and even I could understand it in the end after it had been explained to me a few times, how the cost of risk are accumulating over time and how they get realized. And I can commend it to you for a patient study, chapter 5 in the new report that is coming out. Because I think, even though I don't believe that the economic argument at the end of the day is going to convince our political leaders only, there are a few other elements, but it will help them to create a very strong government-led and political agenda for the way disaster risk needs to be confronted. So while this, let's say, maldevelopment, or the lack of being able to integrate fully risk thinking firmly into the center of development, where there may be many components that drives the lack of determination in doing this. And some of them we understand well, you understand them well. Others is also must be explained in lack of connectivity between policy, available data, planning, use of budget instruments, and setting targets in social sectors. And these are instruments that we are very familiar with using in other sectors. Many of you have done environmental budgeting, others have been doing gender budgeting. So it's not that the instruments are not quite well known. So what does it take to get away from what is now, I would say, very often lead to wastage, that we do parallel work in similar institutions, set up policies that have not been integrated, and instead they're trying to achieve basically the same things through different policy tracks, institutional programmatic capabilities. Now, there are countries that have really tackled these things, and I think they will prove in the next few years that this is an effective way of moving. Whether it's risk reduction or climate adaptation, it's a bit the same dilemma. But at the economic end of this, not taking the opportunity of rational use of these instruments, of course, accumulates, let's say, the negative side of a country's economy. Whether you don't see it as direct losses, but you see it as lack of profits, I would say. So this accumulation, while not achieving the development targets, is also harming directly, I think, poverty reduction and the improvement of social equity. Because the reality is that the most visible impact of the lack of use of development as an instrument to reduce risk is affecting the most exposed populations already in the country. And I think we just look at what happened over the past 14 to 16 months, and we can see how the instrument is blunt, but it is actually not as blunt as that, because you can see, if you just think about the landslides and floods in Rio de Janeiro last May. The people that were most affected were the wealthier people, because they are the ones who live on the slopes. It's cooler. So the social construct of a society really leads sometimes to our own advocacy that the most vulnerable people are the poorest people to be contradicted, and show that the way that we organize our society in many different ways, in fact, really make all of us vulnerable. And I hope also that is going to drive the agenda for the next few years, that some of the richest countries in the world today, and in fact the terrible tragedy of Japan, as I said, I think that is going to also determine our conversation, because if a highly sophisticated society like Japan, like New Zealand, like Australia, well prepared, educated population, allowing planning to lead, and still, when confronted with events of this type, it is so difficult to foresee really the magnitude and the scale, and really also how society will react. So we get tested over and over and over again. So for me it's really a message that we must not focus on countries that are low income or middle income. We have to focus on the total spectrum of risk that our countries are facing. And given that our development, and I say ours because it really is, we all contribute to its survival, development approach, which is constant accumulation and consumption, really contributes to increasing the vulnerabilities. I don't think many of us are individually willing to sacrifice anything, but I think individually we can become a lot more aware of some of the big decisions that governments will be called upon to take in order to deal with risk nationally and regionally. Because the opportunity is, of course, also to look at the risks that we share when we move forward into this direction. The climate change trigger, I must confess that I think the release of the climate discussion, climate as a trigger for disasters was firmly placed in the Yoga Framework for Action, and none of us here need to be convinced that that's a trigger of disasters. But for all kinds of reasons, it's not really become a very strongly debated, discussed, and well understood driver until in the last few years. But that has really helped also to see the broader vulnerability across the board. And climate change, weather variability, whatever you like to call it, is the strongest driver of disasters and the cost of disaster risk. Environmental degradation, the impact of climate change in urban risk profiles, weakening of rural livelihoods because of the weather variability, all these I think you are very familiar with. And climate change in itself will add yet another stress factor, and as you know, many countries in the world are today already defined as stressed from water shortages. I think there is quite strong consensus among many scientists and practitioners that among all the threats that our economies face, the most serious one is in fact water shortage, water stress. A very creeping, gradual crisis that, like many of the gradual and creeping crises that we are not ready to tackle, some of them because we really don't know how to tackle them. And in the case of water, many countries, many national governments are already, I think, very stressed by the water situation. So the countries in this region, I think, are particularly not alone, but you have a very high vulnerability to the impact of climate in many, many ways. And particularly to what we would like to call for a lot more research, study and practice on the socio-economic impact, the socio-economic development, and the geophysical characteristics of climate change. If you remember the now quite old IPCC report, thank you, that was issued in 2007, it strangely enough pointed out that increased precipitation would be the characteristic in Central Asia and a drying of South Asia.